and get started. I would be remiss if I didn't start out by thanking our select board. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the advocacy that our select board has demonstrated, and also I want to thank the what we're calling now CCP, the Concerned Citizens of Plymouth, who have worked in concert with the select board to bring before the residents of Plymouth the opportunity to vote on a rights-based ordinance. And so this is an opportunity to learn about an RBO. And I did prepare just maybe 3 or 4 minutes of written comment, even though we're a small group tonight and probably due to the weather. I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway because this is televised, I've been informed. So let me just share those thoughts. While Northern Pass looms large in our concerns for its threatened destruction of our Main Street as we know it, passing a rights-based ordinance is not only a logical step to stop this particular corporate exploitation, but it simply makes sense for the current and long-term future protection of our health, safety, and welfare as a community. Many have asked, some of you as select board members, as CCP members, and certainly I've been asked a number of times, why is it so difficult to exercise local rights? And what we're really talking about is our inalienable constitutional rights of local self-control over basic matters such as health and safety. Consider, if you will, and I've used this as an analogy, something that I think we're all very familiar with, the Electoral College. A contrived control by legislative leaders to wrest authority from citizens because they believed you and I are not adequately enlightened to make important decisions for the good of the people. And we've seen that exercised historically. By similar fiat, legislative leaders stripped you and me of local control over our ability to protect our health, safety, and welfare. They did so by granting, and this is an important concept to understand, they did so by granting personhood rights to corporations, especially large corporations, and creating statutory, regulatory laws that actually give higher legal privilege to those corporations than to you and me, than to human beings. So when faced, this is our local issue, so when faced with the prospect of losing Main Street businesses, as has happened in the past with far less intrusive projects on Main Street, altering our vibrant Main Street culture, and we have an incredible culture, disrupting emergency routes, destroying aesthetics, property values plummeting. And just for a minute, let me mention, we all know Owl's Nest, a very vibrant, thriving business, major sales of condominiums, beautiful landscape, great golf course, managed by an individual who was a very successful business person. And as soon as it was announced, more than 7 years ago, and as soon as that Northern Pass was going to go through that piece of property, and when balloons, orange balloons, were flown at the height and at the locations where the towers were going to be, since that day, no condominiums have been sold, and that very successful business person who has made tremendous contributions to the state of New Hampshire has gone bankrupt. So property values plummeting, tax revenues not being collected, increased expenses to conducting repairs associated with workarounds of Northern Pass's installation, and so on. With all of that, how do we legitimately and effectively object to such a horrendous project? There's really currently only one sanctioned way, and that is to oppose the project through the existing regulatory process. And the use of that structure is what we've already done, and we've done so for nearly 8 years. Through signs, rallies, press conferences, appeals, challenges, thousands of people, many organizations, thousands of hours of verbal and written testimony, and much more. And we may still get this project. Why? Because that regulatory structure, and this is the basis of what is so important about an RBO. That structure, that regulatory structure that is our only opportunity to object, assures the permitting of corporate projects because it is designed and heavily influenced by corporate lobbyists. And it's designed so that they themselves who wrote it can meet the requirements of the law. I think it's well worth understanding that SEC's job, the Site Evaluation Committee, the committee that is now evaluating thousands of pages of opposition testimony, their job, it's worth knowing that their job is to issue permits if the corporation meets the regulatory requirements. Doesn't matter how passionate we are, how much conviction we have about protecting our rights in our town. They have to follow the law. And the law means the law that's been created by corporate influence has been created in such a way that as long as they dot their I's and cross their T's in their application process, they get permitted. It's also worth knowing that in SEC's entire history, they have never denied a permit. So these are the reasons why we need a new tool that truly serves the people. A rights-based ordinance can do that. A Plymouth Bill of Rights, a tool to assert our local governing rights, an inalienable right, by the way, under our state constitution, guaranteed by our state constitution. And I think our next best hope and effort to ban Northern Pass. But again, this is bigger than Northern Pass. An RBO allows us to elevate your rights, our rights as residents, as human beings, above the claimed rights of corporations and no longer the other way around. In other words, an RBO will allow us to restore democracy. So that's just some thoughts about why an RBO, why it's needed, and what we've faced with 8 years of just tremendous opposition, and we may still get it. So we need a different way of doing business because it isn't working for the people. I want to introduce Michelle Sanborn. Michelle, not a Plymouth resident, but the director of the New Hampshire Community Rights Network, and works very closely with CellDef out of Pennsylvania. CellDef is the community Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I think they originally got organized because people like us were very concerned about what was happening in Pennsylvania regarding fracking. Is that what?
Started with sludge.
Oh, okay, with sludge. Okay. And that kind of morphed into a nonprofit that has assisted communities around the country doing what we're doing right now, assisting with the construction of the language of an RBO to present to local citizens for their vote. There are about 11 in New Hampshire now that have it, about 200 nationally. The first one in New Hampshire was Barnstead, and Barnstead for 5 years fought an organization, and they had the first RBO in New Hampshire, and this was an organization, a corporation that wanted to extract water from their aquifer, and their proposal was to extract the equivalent amount of water that the entire town of Barnstead used on a daily basis, and Barnstead determined that that would damage their aquifer, so they fought them. And with the benefit of the RBO, after 5 years, that corporation went bankrupt.
Just a note on that, so my apologies, it was Nottingham that was dealing with the water extraction.
Oh.
Barnstead watched what was going on in Nottingham.
Okay.
And they decided to
Thank you.
in the RBO proactively so that they did experience the same experience that the Nottingham residents.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay.
Just in case
Thanks.
anyone looks it up.
This is why Michelle is here. Thanks, Michelle.
Absolutely.
And Michelle is the one who has been such a tremendous help in having us get here to where we are now with the language. By way of introductory comment, anything else that you want to comment on?
Sure. I think it's really important for everyone to understand that this is your community, and this is about you deciding what you envision for your community.
Oh, Michelle, yeah, because we are being taped, would you mind using the microphone? Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dick. I just think that it's really important for everyone to keep in mind that this is your community, and this is about deciding what you envision for your community. And our communities are not just made up of human beings, our communities are also made up of natural environments that we depend upon. And when those natural environments are affected negatively by a corporate activity, then we quite often confront within ourselves the question of, how does that connect us to nature? How does that connect us to each other within our community? And the realization and recognition that all of that is intertwined, dependent upon each other, and that's what makes a community, not just the human beings, but the natural environment that we also depend upon, which is often irreparably affected by corporate projects. So I think that it's important to keep in mind that you have the right to decide what happens in your community. There may be different opinions about that. And so I think that, looking into this and understanding it with your own mind and your own research is really important, which is what this is about, is that informational opportunity. Another little tidbit, I was in Concord this morning and received some information last night regarding a bill that is being proposed in the New Hampshire legislation. And it's this kind of bill that made me think about, I was really pleased to think about ending my day here as opposed to the kind of legislation that is quite often proposed. And this piece of legislation is literally entitled Preempt Local Regulation Regarding Seeds and Fertilizer. So this is what's called the Super Preemption Bill, which is all about removing local control. So this is not, just a single issue thing. This is not just a Northern Pass thing. This is a who has authority to wield the governing power. And our New Hampshire Constitution is clear that that comes from the people in our Bill of Rights. And I think that when local communities assert that, then there's going to be a different perspective and a different view of that in Concord, as well as amongst corporations that may come into the state with the intent of assuming that they can just come in and do as they please without regard to the individual people and the natural environments that are affected.
Any questions for Michelle about that? Okay, thank you, Michelle. The handouts that were back there, if you haven't picked them up, Michelle, you brought something as well. Did you put something on the table?
I did. I brought some information regarding a constitutional amendment that's being proposed.
Okay.
To secure the right of focus.
CACR 19, that one? Okay. There's a sheet back there about a constitutional amendment, and we have one of the experts in the room who's one of the co-sponsors of it, Representative Rand, if there are questions about that. What's important about that is while a number of communities are pursuing RBOs, and as you know, 11 already have RBOs, in concert with that is what is being proposed at the legislative level, the constitutional amendment. So when we may get into conversation about that. Because some have asked the question about, well, shouldn't we be dealing with Concord? Shouldn't we be approaching our legislators? The answer is yes, of course, and that is happening. So this is not operating in silos. The other three handouts is the full RBO itself. It's actually a 9-page document, but I left the last page off because it was just blank signatory page. So you have the 8 pages of it, and then and I apologize for the small print, but we were trying to save some money. The large print one is a summary of the RBO, and just to quickly run down it, there's the preamble, some declaration, statements of principles on grievances, and definitions of what certain things mean in it. Then the third section is statement of law, and that refers to the Bill of Rights for Plymouth. And then prohibitions under Section 4 in order to secure the Bill of Rights. Section 5 is enforcement. How would we enforce it? And if you look on the back of that sheet, this one here, you'll see what are enforcement issues related to corporate powers, sustainable energy policy, and so on. And then the final handout was some frequently asked questions about rights-based ordinances. So if you have questions, you might want to look down through that sheet. So I'm going to kind of leave it to you to say how you wish to proceed. Do you want to walk through any parts of the RBO? Do you have some specific questions that you've come with? Because we have a number of people who may be able to respond to that. Frank?
Yes, I'm not certain, but didn't we already have...
You want to ask your question up here, or I could repeat it if I could?
I thought the town of Plymouth already had a kind of a rights-based ordinance already in it, but was a policy. Yeah. How do we
Frank,
supersede that, or do we modify
okay.
it?
Frank was asking, I thought the town of Plymouth already had an RBO. That's true. In 2012, Plymouth passed an RBO. Unfortunately, there was a glitch, and that RBO, when it went before the voters at town meeting, did not have the full RBO attached to the warrant article, and therefore the board accepted it as advisory only. So it's really not been enacted. This you know, would supersede that. Okay. Other questions? Mike? Oh, that's no. So yes.
Chris Woods. I guess I have a number of questions. It's clear what the potential benefits are, but I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what's our potential legal exposure. You know, if a corporation challenges, presumably we go to court. What might the town expect to incur? Right. And then secondly, just procedurally, if a particular matter comes up that we want to oppose after the ordinance is in place, a particular matter comes up, is that a warrant article then? Do we say we are voting as a town to say no to Northern Pass or to a development on Tenny Mountain Highway, or how does that work?
Okay, thank you, Chris. The first part of the question was, you understand the benefits of an RBO. What about the downside? There's certainly a risk. There's no question about that. The question I think to ask is, well, what are the risks? Are there some monetary risks? Potentially. What are the monetary risks or the other risks if we don't proceed with an RBO? And I think that's where the real answer lies. And it's those things I mentioned earlier on. What do we want our Main Street to look like? What do we want our, and again, we're not talking here just about Northern Pass, okay? This is much bigger than Northern Pass. What do we want our quality of water to be? If we have plummeting property values for any of those reasons, how do we collect the level of taxation that supports the services that we have in our town right now? What do we want to leave to our children? So the bigger questions are really, if we don't do it, what are the costs to the town? And I think the costs are very significant, very significant. You asked a technical question about
Procedurally, how, once the ordinance is in place, how does it then apply to a particular
one of the things that's likely to happen, let's say on next Wednesday, the 31st, at special town meeting, we approve and adopt this new ordinance. And then let's say Northern Pass, Eversource, Hydro-Quebec gets upset. They don't want to see a roadblock in their way. And they choose to sue us. One of the things to keep in mind about what corporations frequently do is the threat of suit. And one of the things that the threat of a suit does is diverts our attention away from the real issues and retreating back into let's not cause any expense, without looking at what's the real expense that we just talked about earlier. And frequently, those threats are just that. They're threats because they know that people go away when they threaten. And why wouldn't they? Look at the money they've got. You know, they can carry it on. We can't, they think, if we're weak, if we don't stand up and recognize the real costs down the road, if we don't oppose this, if we don't stop this. We got a pretty special community, and we don't want that community to be altered in negative ways.
Sam Sargent, may I play devil's advocate for a moment?
Yes, certainly.
Imagine that it's a week and a day from today, we're up at the meeting, somebody stands up and says, why do you feel you need this? What are we protecting against? What's the threat?
Well, the real threat, you're talking about Northern Pass now.
If Northern Pass was not in existence, we wouldn't be sitting in this room, would we?
Well, my answer to that would be we should be sitting in this room, regardless of Northern Pass, because we want to hand to our children and theirs clean water, clean air, the beautiful views that we have settled here for, the nature of the community that we experience, and so on. There are all kinds of corporate exploitations that can create harm for Plymouth or any community, and they've done so. They've destroyed communities. So it seems to me it's very clear what we're protecting.
I think it forces corporations to do the right thing. They wouldn't be digging up Main Street. They would have a completely different alternative than digging up Main Street.
I didn't catch it.
Being taped, so they want you to.
I just feel that it forces the corporations to do the right thing. They wouldn't be digging up Main Street. They'd be coming up with something that would be agreeable and wouldn't necessarily be opposed by so many. So I think this RBO forces these corporations to do the right thing.
Thank you, Gil. I would add something to that, and this piece of my concern is related directly to Northern Pass. What kind of a community, what kind of citizens do we choose to be when we know, for example, that Hydro-Quebec, where this power would come from, has flooded a piece of land in Quebec equivalent to the entire size of the state of New Hampshire? Living in that area were the Pessamit Inuit, native Canadian. They weren't consulted. They were just flooded out of their homes. Their livelihood, which was stream fishing primarily, was destroyed. So their way of life has been destroyed. In addition to that, when you flood a piece of property, and it includes timber, when timber rots underwater, it emits methane, and methane is one of the major contributors to global warming. So this is an opportunity that's even bigger to make a statement and do something about preserving our planet. When we do that, we preserve Plymouth as well. Yes?
Are any other towns pursuing the RSO? Or
The RBO?
Or the RBO?
The question is, are many other towns pursuing the RBO? There are 11 communities in the state of New Hampshire. There are 200 communities, approximately, I don't know the exact number, you know that one, in the country that have developed RBOs. So this is a movement, and it's taking root. And it's a way of saying to our state and federal legislators that there are issues that need to be corrected in the way we're doing business relative to protecting local rights.
Well, more specifically in regard to this project, the Northern Pass project, I'm just curious if
Yes.
any towns are.
Yes.
pursuing it.
So the further part of the question is, are there towns pursuing RBOs specifically related to trying to stop Northern Pass? I would say they're doing what we're doing. And there are 5 additional ones, to my knowledge, right now that are pursuing it, in addition to the 11 who have it. For example, up north on the route of the Northern Pass installation, Sugar Hill, Easton. Does Franconia have one? I don't think Franconia has one. I can tell you the towns.
They already have it in place.
Yeah.
And that's where they're proposing to dig up their main street. It's been in place for a while.
And I know that Representative Vincent Migliore, who represents 5 communities adjacent to here, Bristol, Ashland, Bridgewater, Alexandria, Hebron, maybe? No. Well, five communities. At any rate, he has challenged each of his communities to consider an RBO and has held meetings with those. And right now, Ashland is one of the towns. There's a group called ARBO. Ashland
Residents for a Rights-Based Ordinance.
Ashland Residents for a Rights-Based Ordinance. And they will be presenting a warrant article with an RBO attached at their March town meeting. So yes, people are pursuing this. I think the flame was Northern Pass, but I also believe they see the greater value of an RBO. Other questions? Frank?
Yes. I hear the site committee is meeting at the end of February to make their decision, or is it moved back?
Yes, the site evaluation committee will render a verbal decision by the end of February, and it has to be confirmed in writing by the end of March.
Okay, because I wondered if our new rights-based ordinance would have any legal effect after the fact.
I don't, the question is, if we pass an RBO, will it have an effect on SEC? I don't think so. Once again, when you think about the role of SEC is to evaluate the proposal. Certainly they'll listen to what everybody has said, but when it comes down to it, their job is to permit or not permit, depending upon whether the application has been presented in the regulatory fashion.
I'm just thinking that
Will it be?
once,
Go ahead.
Once an applicant has made an application for a land use permit, you can't change the codes and standards of their application.
One of the things that an RBO will do is anything that's in the works, if an RBO is passed, and Michelle, chime in if I have this wrong, if there has not been any action digging and going through our town, we can prevent it once it is approved. It's an RBO on March 31. If it's passed on March 31, if the board chooses to sign it that day, I'm sorry, January 31, right, January 31, Plymouth special town meeting, it takes effect January 31.
May I speak to that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want me up there?
Michelle, why? Yeah.
So I think a couple of things to address there, and if you don't mind, I'm going to go back a little bit. There was a question about legality and court proceeding and that procedure. Anyone can sue anyone for anything at any time. The local ordinance doesn't change that. The amendment doesn't change that. Nothing changes that. So that is true regardless of the local law. Or any kind of constitutional amendment that would recognize the right of local self-government. So the process that would likely take place, and I think that it's important to clarify that I am not a lawyer. I do work with Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund as a community organizer for the state of New Hampshire. So I'm not a lawyer. Obviously, I work in this day in and day out, and I do work with a team of lawyers, but I myself am not. So I'm not giving any legal advice here. What I'm sharing with you is what has happened in other communities. And what has happened there usually is that the developer sees this kind of action from a local municipality as an obstacle to achieve the goal that they have in mind, which is whatever that project may be. Their goal, understandably, is to profit, and nobody has a problem with corporations profiting. The issue, as Gail brought up, is are they going to do that responsibly, or are they going to do that at the expense of the health, safety, and welfare of the people and the natural environments of a community? Most often, we see that they may attempt to override the will of the people and impose something that is not wanted. And when I say most often, I'm also not referring to your typical local corporations, your local businesses, because being local, those individuals usually live either in or very near the community that is affected and are not interested in detrimental actions against the community because it then affects their business as well. We're talking about corporations that come in from outside the state, outside the country sometimes. And these decisions are being made in boardrooms thousands upon thousands of miles away, or they're being made in DC. You know, they're not affected directly by what happens in that community, so therefore the interest is usually more narrowly focused on the profit that they can make. And if that's to the detriment of the community, then often the opinion is so be it. And that's what we're talking about. So I just think it's important to bring about that clarification that this is not anti-corporate, it's not anti-business, it's responsible business. And it's about putting the power back into the hands of the people to be able to make those decisions, as opposed to the current perspective of law and government is that power resides within the hands of the corporation. And there's reasons for that, and if we want to get into that in this discussion, I'm more than happy to go there. But all that to kind of set the stage to say that typically what would happen is that the corporation would attempt to or serve papers to the town because they would view that particular ordinance as an obstacle. The other option is that the municipality or an individual within the community, because there is a provision for any resident within the community to enforce the ordinance as well, to take a proactive measure, which might start with a cease and desist letter or a notification that, look, we have this rights-based ordinance, and the activity that you intend to bring within our community is going to violate that local law. That very well may trigger the lawsuit, from the corporation, because they say, oh, they're actually serious about this. Really, they meant that? And so the object, of course, is to eliminate the obstacles. I'm speaking from the perspective of the corporation. The object is to remove the obstacles so that they can move forward with their plan. And so in the actual verbiage of the ordinance, if you have that, do you have that handout with you? If you reference section 4, statements of law, there was a question regarding permits. And in section 4, letter F, it says, no government shall recognize as valid any permit, license, privilege, charter, or other authorization issued to a corporation by any state or federal entity that would enable the corporation to violate the rights or prohibitions of this law. So a lot of what we understand about rights is our perception. Do we believe the rights that we claim that we have? And there's nothing within this ordinance that forces the municipality to enforce the ordinance. There's nothing within the ordinance that forces a resident to enforce the ordinance. So that being said, I'm not suggesting that it not be enforced, because why would you go through the effort of it? On the other hand, there's this element that we all understand is discretion. And there may be some times when it really makes sense to enforce an ordinance, and then there's times when it may not make sense. An example would be, you shouldn't be trespassing on my private property. You trespass on my private property, you're wrong, I can file charges against you. But maybe it's the first time you've been on my property, and I'm like, get off my property, I don't want you here, and you leave. That's great, no harm done. But you come back on my property a week later, and I ask you to leave again, and then you keep doing it. Eventually, I'm gonna be like, you're not getting the message, so here we go, I'm gonna file charges. That's discretionary. It's just an example of discretionary. So what this is about is providing an environment, a basis for your community to decide what happens here, to hold corporations accountable for the decisions that they're making that affect you and your community. And so ideally, you would want some kind of a notification. Let's say that they ignore the ordinance and they come in with bulldozers. Well, then a decision needs to be made by the community. The whole goal of the ordinance, the rights-based ordinance, is just that. It's rights-based, not land use. So we're not talking about regulatory law. We're not talking about statutory law. What we're talking about is rights that are claimed within the ordinance, which are based upon the New Hampshire Constitution as well as the Declaration of Independence, which is where our state constitution came from. So it could be a proactive measure by someone within the community or by the governing body of the municipality, or that could be triggered actually by the corporation taking an action against the community, as a whole. So did that address?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And Dick also brought up a point about the movement that's involved here. So I want to give a little bit of a bigger picture of, yes, in New Hampshire, there's 11 communities that have enacted rights-based ordinances. This year, for 2018 town meeting, there are 3 communities moving forward. There's a 4th one that has a town council, so it's a bit of a different process. By going to a town council, you don't really have the town meeting process the way you would traditionally. And so they would have the ability to bring something forth at any time throughout the year through a charter amendment. And that's coinciding with what's going on with the amendment, and this goes beyond New Hampshire. So Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund partners with what we call state community rights networks. There's one in New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, and Oregon. And each of these states are made up of numerous communities, just like in New Hampshire, that are finding themselves in a position of being told what's going to happen to them, when and how, as opposed to them being able to make those decisions for themselves. And they're doing exactly what Plymouth is looking at doing next week at your special town meeting. So it's a broad movement. It also expands internationally. So there are cultures, indigenous cultures that have reached out to Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund to work with them with their tribal constitutions, to work in these rights within their tribal constitutions. There's certainly a perspective of embracing rights of nature a bit more in other cultures than we see in the Western cultures. And quite often that's the perspective that they're reaching out from, is to say that we recognize that we are one with our environment, and when we protect our environment, we're in essence protecting ourselves. We get more into, I think, the kind of political and legalities and things like that in the Western culture, which is fine, and that's what the depth of the rights-based ordinance seeks to address. Expenses. Being a rights-based ordinance, this is about constitutional rights. Rights are a higher law than statutory law, and it's a different legal procedure that takes place when you have a rights argument versus a land use or statutory argument. So, could there be legal expenses incurred? Yes, there could. That's true for any lawsuit. They would be less than going through the regulatory process. Dick referred to the example in Nottingham. They went through almost $500,000 of taxpayer money to attempt to fight that project through the regulatory system, and all the permits were issued, in spite of the scientific evidence that revealed that the community would be left with no water, essentially, and that it also, during their 2-week test period, drew in contaminants from over 2 miles away. But that's okay, because the corporation said that they would take care of it. So all the permits got issued because every I was dotted, every T was crossed. And it wasn't until the community enacted a rights-based ordinance and that community members acted proactively on that by sending a copy of their rights-based ordinance, finding out every new investment interest on that property, letting them know that they had a rights-based ordinance and that as a community and residents of the community, they intended to act on it, discouraged every future investor, which drove the corporation into bankruptcy. That was USA Springs, and they did come back. They came back actually last year and attempted to repurchase that property for back taxes. And the community is now moving forward with a new rights-based ordinance for 2018 because they enacted theirs in 2008. They wanted to bring it up to speed. They wanted to modernize their language. They also wanted to include some additional protections like toxic waste disposal, prohibiting that, and also legalizing nonviolent direct action within their rights-based ordinance. So they're bringing some additional protections into it. So this is, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's about staying engaged, being engaged, and forever being watchful. So thank you for the time. I don't want to infringe upon others' questions. So.
Thank you, Michelle. That Nottingham example should boil our blood. I think this is yours. Hi, David.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to let you know that your voice is out of sync with what on the TV. You stopped moving. Your mouth stopped moving about 2 seconds later. The
Oh.
The sound stops. But,
Okay.
I
Well,
have a
you benefit from no lapse here.
I just want you to know that. My wife and I are sitting at home listening to this, and we came up with a couple of questions. First of all, we were told some time ago that if you know about something going on, you can't pass an ordinance against what's going on, okay? This is something that was brought up in a town meeting a long time ago, due to something that happened like out on Tenny Mountain Highway, or I forget what it was exactly about.
Once the application was presented, you can't change an ordinance to prevent it from being developed, or prevent the application from going forward.
And then the other thing is, if we do pass this is another question my wife and I had come up. We do pass this, I'm going to use a term that what prevents like tree huggers from going like, oh, you got this passed and you can't now do this and you can't do that. You understand what I'm saying? Not that I don't think the tree hugging's nice, because I go out and lean against one every now and then myself. You understand what I'm trying to say?
I think so.
Being used against us for maybe future development. An example, like the cornfield, you know, the problems we went through out there.
Yeah.
And look what the amount of jobs it's brought in. So could they use this against us for further development in our own community, for the chance of jobs, more jobs coming into the area and stuff like that?
Okay, I think I understand your question, and thank you for it, David. The question is, can the ordinance, if we pass it, be used against us? When you say they is us.
Right.
They is the town, and they is any individual resident of the town. There's nothing in the ordinance that creates a liability for local landowners to do with their property what they've always done, so long as what they do is not in any way infringing upon or endangering the health, the safety, the welfare of the community as written into the ordinance. If someone is doing that, we probably want to speak up about that. But the example of tree hugging, no, that's not
Well, the
an
example I
issue.
gave was like out at the cornfield, all the problems we went with the cornfield, and now look what they've done with it, and it's brought jobs and prosperity into our community, and not say anything about the tax money. And can they use this as a tool against our town to stop further progress on?
No, once again.
Good for the town.
Once again, this is a rights-based ordinance that allows people in the town itself and people within the town to exercise their rights to prevent corporations from exploiting and coming in with siting of facilities or doing projects that can harm the town the way we describe our protections within the ordinance. So externally, Michelle, maybe you can speak to this, but
so if we'll say example, Home Depot wanted to come in here and build a great big place for that kind of a thing.
No, they shouldn't be allowed to do that.
And see what I mean?
Representative Rand says no.
I was just using it as an example.
I know.
Can somebody say, oh, this is my right, I want it stopped?
Yeah, well, Alexis, go ahead, and if you want to respond to that.
To clarify, and you're going to have to repeat what I say, so I'm not up there. Doesn't the town have to hold a vote on whether or not they want those types of projects? So it's really about democracy.
Well, that would be true if someone within the town objected to it and wanted to stop a project. You know, it goes through our own processes, zoning and planning and so on. And so long as a project comes in and it's proposed that it build a box store or whatever, and it's in a location, and it's done in such a manner that it is not infringing upon our water, our scenic view, or whatever we decide, then it could be permitted at the same time, as long as it's not violating anything within the ordinance. At the same time, if someone then decides to try to challenge that, then I do believe the town would make that there is something about the vote, but I'm not clear about that myself. So maybe you can speak to that one.
So a couple things. The rights-based ordinance is drafted to be specific to the concerns of the community. So referencing, if you have that full version of the rights-based ordinance in your hands, if you reference, it's called titled Section 2 Definitions. And in that section, you're going to see a list of definitions. The first one being corporation. So we're defining what we mean by a corporation within this ordinance. Ecosystem, toxic waste disposal, toxic waste, exploratory data collecting, energy systems, and unsustainable energy systems are the listed definitions there. So what I'm hoping to walk you through is how the different sections of the ordinance are related to other sections within the ordinance. So those are your definitions, which just means that's what we mean when those terms are being used within this ordinance. It's not defining those terms for everyday use. Those are definitions for the terms for this ordinance. The next section is Section 3, Statements of Law, a Community Bill of Rights. So these are the rights within this particular rights-based ordinance that are being enumerated. So listed out, and then there's some descriptions of what those mean. So that's what that section is addressing. So right to sustainable energy future, that sounds like a familiar term. What does sustainable energy future mean? Well, then we go back to the definitions. What is unsustainable? Helps us understand, and then there's also that explanation as to what is meant by sustainable. Right to scenic preservation, peaceful enjoyment of your home, pure water, clean air, rights of ecosystems, governmental legitimacy, right of local community self-government, right to exercise the right of self-government, and rights as self-executing. So those are the rights that are being enumerated, your own community bill of rights. The next section, Section 4, Statements of Law, now we're getting into prohibitions. And why are there prohibitions? Because it's necessary to secure the Bill of Rights. So here is where we get a little more into the nitty-gritty of things. And within this section, it talks about what is considered unlawful within this Bill of Rights. And why would those things be unlawful? Because they violate the Bill of Rights that are enumerated, all of those rights that are enumerated within the ordinance. So it's here where you see that it's not about neighbor against neighbor, making a claim that, well, you cut down a tree and so therefore you violated my right to a healthy climate, or, I don't know. People are very creative and can come up with a lot of interesting explanations and ideas. And so this is written very specifically because conversations were had, about what is it that the community is looking to protect, what is it that the community envisions for itself, for its future, and then language is drafted and agreed upon, basically by a core group of people that is then presenting it to the community to say, do you agree with this? Does this resonate with you? And you make that decision when you vote. And so this is about learning what's in here, what the RBO is, what it isn't, and RBO stands for Rights-Based Ordinance. And so I think it's important to understand the different sections of the ordinance to better understand how they relate with one another. If there are specific questions about those statements of law or definitions, I'm happy to answer that. I just don't want to take time giving information that isn't being asked for. Is that helpful?
No, I'm still confused about it.
So it's primarily addressed against corporate harms, corporate activity. So there's already rules, regulations, statutory law about what you can and cannot do with your personal private property. Those are not affected by the rights-based ordinance at all. We can't dump toxic waste on our personal property. There's usually some kind of local zoning or ordinances that say that you can't build a structure, you know, so many feet within your property line, things of that nature. And certainly, if anyone damages the property of a neighbor, well, that falls under the regular laws of the land. That person has the right to, you know, file charges against you. And the ordinance doesn't change any of that. It doesn't even really speak to any of that because that's not the purpose of the ordinance. The purpose of the ordinance is to assert the rights of the community and to protect it from harmful corporate activities, not your neighbor and the activities that they may be doing on their property, which are already addressed in other laws.
So I'd like to maybe amplify a little bit of what Chris Woods said and a little bit about what Dave said.
Want to say who you are, please?
My name is Mike Ahern. I'm a landowner in Plymouth, and
You Omar's relative?
in a roundabout way, yeah. And there is the proposed route is going right in front of my farm, so there's probably not a whole lot of people that wants this to go away more than me. So I want to preface with a short little story. I just cannot, in my mind, imagine why anybody would be for this. I really can't figure that out. So I went up north, knowing that all those communities are so dead set against this line going through their communities, Franconia and Sugar Hill and all that. And I went up, I had business to do up north, so I figured I'd stop in, have breakfast, it was early in the morning, and talk to some of the locals. These locals had no clue what I was talking about. Northern Pass, they go, we'd heard of it, but they had no clue. And it's because it was the next town over, or it was 2 towns over. It wasn't affecting them. They didn't care. It wasn't something they even had to be knowledgeable about. So I want residents along this route to realize it's divide and conquer. They only have to worry about us. That's all they're fighting right now. And it all hit home when I went to Concord. And I thank Gail and I thank Dick for everything that they've done to fight this. But when I went to Concord, I expected to see roads blocked and to see just a swarm of cars and people. And there were a number of orange vests and shirts that were orange and the caps. I loved it. I brought my kids there. But there should have been, that Capitol should have been filled with people, and it wasn't. So that brought home a couple of things. It's only a small portion of the state. The SEC is listening to the whole state. They're not only listening to Plymouth and the communities along this route. It is going to be very difficult to fight this. So now comes the RBO. And I've tried to educate myself on it. And if there is a chance that this could help, I'm all for it. I'm just a little confused on what it would do. And Chris Wood brought up an excellent comment. When there was a couple of individuals trying to stop the town boards from allowing an applicant to build a box store along the river in the flood zone. The town spent over $100,000 in attorney's fees to back up the environmentally sensitive zone that we had on our books, in that ordinance. We spent a lot of money. So I just want you to be aware, when this RBO becomes enacted, because enough people at that special, it's not going to be at a regular town meeting, it's a regular town meeting, but it's a special one for just those involved in that one subject. And when the people show up, because everybody's telling you, you got to show up for this, you know, it's only those interested in that one subject will show up. No other people will be showing up, I don't expect, or just happen to walk in because there's something else being voted on. That one thing is targeted to try and get passed, and I get that. And once that's enacted and voted upon by the citizens, it becomes law. Then, to answer, I believe I'm going to try and piggyback on what Chris said. If there's even 1 or 2 people in the community that want to stop something, they can bring in CELDAF. It doesn't have to be the town. It could be a resident. And bring CELDAF in. And the town, as I understand, could be on the hook for attorney's fees to back up the ordinance that we then passed. Now, Franconia already has an RBO. That hasn't deterred Eversource in the least bit. They are going full force towards Franconia, not only in their community, but planning to rip up their main street. It has no difference in that.
Have they enacted the RBO yet?
I believe it is inactive.
I'm not even aware of Franconia having a rates-based ordinance. I know Sugar Hill and Easton.
No, all right, they have it on their books as an ordinance, but what you have to do is you have to then have someone in the community or someone in the town to say, we are now going to stop you from what you're doing based on our RBO. So they have it, but it hasn't deterred Eversource in the least bit. And as far as I understand, an RBO really can't use its teeth until after the applicant has gotten all their approvals and have started digging, and then all of a sudden the town says, that's not being done the way that it showed on the plan that you got your approval from. It's going to affect the community. We're enacting our RBO. Now the stopwatches start with the attorney's fees. That's when things, so it may not, Franconia may not enact it. They may. Plymouth will be in the same boat. What Dave said, when you read stuff about scenic vistas and protecting aquifers, they said the same things about the box store that was planning to build 500 feet from the river based on our environmentally sensitive zone. And they talked about the aquifers and certain things that would affect the welfare and the health and safety of the community. That would have definitely qualified. They are a corporation. So despite the fact that the environmentally sensitive zone was enacted many years ago, shortly after it was enacted, we had a laundromat and a car wash built right along the banks of the river, just down the river a little bit more down the road from where the box store was planned. It was, 150 feet from the river? And then same ordinance was in effect. A box store comes in 500 feet back from the river. And it all depends. The reason I'm bringing that up, because it only takes a few individuals in the community to say something's may not be right. Now, what I'm saying about Dave is the right thing. Can this be used for other things? Could it be used to stop a box store because they're bringing in extra power lines, or I'm not sure how it might fit into here. It could be something that everybody on Main Street wants, and everybody in the community and the town government wants. But if a couple of individuals in the community that says, I want to stop this, I've got mine, I want to stop this, they could enact it and bring in CELDAF.
No, not this ordinance.
Right.
Yeah,
It's specific to this situation. They could do a new RBO, a different RBO. But this RBO is very specific to Hydro-Quebec Eversource, right?
Well, I wouldn't even phrase it that way, to be honest with you, because nowhere are their names included. So to really get to the nitty-gritty of what you're asking, those statements of law, the prohibitions within here, talk about what shall be unlawful. So it shall be unlawful within Plymouth for any corporation or government, not talking about individuals, corporation or government, to engage in land acquisition necessary for the construction of an unsustainable energy system, or to engage in construction or siting of any structure to be used in the operation of an unsustainable energy system. Go back to the definitions. What is an unsustainable energy system? What does that mean within this ordinance? Means energy systems that are either, number one, controlled by state and federal energy policies rather than community controlled. Number two, industrial scale hydroelectric power and industrial scale wind power when it is not locally and municipally owned and operated. Number three, energy systems using fossil fuels, including but not limited to coal, natural gas, petroleum products. And it goes on. I'll continue just because I think it's really important to clarify and answer this question directly so that there aren't any uncertainties about what it really means. So to continue on, nuclear, radioactive materials are other fuel sources that are non-renewable or which produce, during operation, toxins and substances that cause injury to humans or ecosystems, or that are in violation of residents' rights secured under this ordinance or under other laws. The term shall not include, I think that this is really important for people to understand as well, combustion of wood or wood products or the use of propane, kerosene, heating oil, coal, or natural gas when combustion of those fossil fuels is used solely to generate on-site heat or power and the energy produced is not commercially sold, transmitted, or distributed. So this is not prohibiting anybody from heating their homes, from having electricity, from utilizing the conveniences that we all need and that we all enjoy. What this is doing is looking at what is considered unsustainable. So when we look at what's unsustainable, when your community doesn't get to make the decisions about things, you don't get to control how that operates within your community. So prices can be set beyond your control. The source of something can be set beyond your control. That's the way the current structure of the system works. The RBO is looking at it and saying, this is your opportunity to voice what you envision for your community as a matter of right, as opposed to land use. So in land use, you have a land use ordinance. That ordinance gets violated, and somebody says, look, you dug 5 feet closer to the property line than you were supposed to. Maybe a violation is done, or carried out, and then the town might go through legal fees to find a way to settle that. With a rights-based ordinance, this is about looking at it and saying, okay, let's say that it's determined that the ordinance is violated. There's a transmission line project that comes through the town, and it is transmitting unsustainable energy as defined by the ordinance. The community has a decision to make. Either the governing body, known as the select board, can take an action, or a resident can take an action, but only within the confines of what is spelled out, defined, enumerated, and listed within the ordinance. So there's nothing in here that talks about big box stores. There's nothing in here that talks about any other industry or type of activity other than what is defined within the ordinance. So looking at those definitions makes it very clear that that's what's being specifically addressed. And then the statements of law is saying that this is what is being prohibited. So in addition to land acquisition, construction, and operation of an unsustainable energy system, there's verbiage in here regarding toxic waste disposal, which is defined by the ordinance. There's also engaging in exploratory data collecting as defined by the ordinance. Persons using corporations or governments to engage in toxic waste disposal in a neighboring municipality will be liable for the harms that are incurred within this community. And then any corporation or government to violate the rights recognized and secured by this law is also a violation. And then I referenced earlier regarding permits, license, privilege, charters, and authorized from there.
So I'd be worried about how lawyers manipulate things after. So Steve had a great point. This is something that we can hit the ground running. Anytime something comes up, we can enact it within a few months. For this big project that takes several years before it goes from conception, when we find out about it, till it gets approved. It's something, so if we could just limit this to Northern Pass, like Steve has suggested, I think there'd be a lot less objection to it.
Yeah, the issue with that, and again, I'm not a lawyer, the issue with that is that you start getting into biases. You can't, from that perspective of, it's not about targeting just one project. That might be what inspired your community to look at a rights-based ordinance and consider it, but it's not addressing a project, it's addressing an activity. And that may be an issue of semantics in your mind, and that's okay, but there's nothing within this ordinance that is addressing a specific project. In our minds, we think of Northern Pass because that is a project that is affecting the community right now. But there's nothing in here that says Northern Pass.
Well, it would have to be a relevant activity.
It would have to be a relevant activity, exactly. So it may not be Northern Pass, but let's say, you know, in 2 years, another project similar to that would meet these definitions, that project, let's say it moved forward, that project may fall as a violation within the rights-based ordinance, so long as it meets and falls within the definitions and the prohibitions. A big box store wouldn't meet that. A home-based business generally isn't going to meet that. I mean, this is talking about industrial scale hydroelectric.
So a year down the road, you can't just resurrect this, dust it off, and say, we want to enact this RBO that we used previously to fight this activity around Hydro-Quebec, Northern Pass. We want to now use it and make it relevant to this big box store proposal. Probably not.
It will remain relevant for the definitions and prohibitions specifically listed within the ordinance.
They're pretty darn specific.
They are very specific.
Could you do a little case study here possibly?
Sure.
So here's the case. Iberdrola decides to run a giant power line down Tenny Mountain Highway. Now,
I think they did.
Guess what?
yeah, they already did this. It's not much of a case, is it? So, but as far as I know, I don't think anybody in town actually knew it was coming. I don't think anybody in town.
Oh, you mean the windmills?
Not the windmills themselves, but the power line that came down Tenny Mountain Highway that took the power away, right?
Yeah, from the windmills. Yeah.
From the windmills, yes.
Right.
Not the windmills themselves, but the.
Can we blow them up so we can get rid
Well,
of
that's
the
a
steam?
different stuff. Sorry, this is not.
That
my
was
case-
snuck in while we were fighting
My
this.
case doesn't have to do with the windmills. My case has to do with the power lines.
I agree.
That took that. Okay. Well, as we know now, we have no leg to stand on in this community to object to anything, because they were doing it by their own land use, their ownership of right of way that they owned didn't prohibit them from doing anything that they wanted to do. Yet, I think if this town had had any say in it, they would have said bury it or do something different in it. So how would the RBO helped us, had we had it in that situation, if that's not a totally unfair question?
Yeah, so I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know exactly how that would play out, but in theory, hypothetically speaking, those transmission lines are carrying, they're involved in the operation of an activity that is prohibited by the RBO. So that's a prohibition. That's not a regulation. That's not saying, well, so long as they're above ground or so long as they're below ground, it's a prohibition. Again, it goes back to what does the community choose to do with that? So I'll leave that there. But according to the verbiage within the ordinance, so long as that activity falls within the definition and a prohibition and is affecting the rights enumerated within the ordinance, then there has the potential for either the municipality or a resident, I mean, anyone can attempt to enforce it at any point in time. Does that mean it's going to succeed? CELDF certainly isn't going to say, like, I don't know, let's say that the town of Plymouth calls us up and says, this power lines coming down through our town, and we disagree with it. It's a violation of our ordinance, and we want to take proactive, legal measures against them. So CELDF would then be in a position of deciding, is this viable? Is it defensible? Just like any other law office would do. It is a nonprofit public interest law firm. But it doesn't mean that the legal team doesn't make the same kinds of decisions. At the end of the day, it's still a law firm. So most lawyers won't take on something that they don't feel they can win. And so there's that discretion goes both ways. You know, the community has a right to discretion, and CELDF has a right to discretion as to if a resident just comes to CELDF and says, we want to enforce this because I heard that there was going to be a project. Well, most courts are going to throw that out. There's no harm in hearing that there might be a project. There's no harm per se in you know, maybe running new wires on the same towers if it's not conducting or transmitting energy that is a violation of the ordinance. See what I mean? It's getting into the verbiage of the ordinance itself. And then again, let's say that they do run the new lines. Is it technically a violation of the ordinance? It may be deemed that way, you know, by a lawyer, which I'm not. And yet they may say, well, you know, how bad do you really want to defend this? Because, you know, what harm has actually been done at that point in time if they're just, let's say, switching out the cables? It is up to the community to decide. If the community decides that they want to enforce it based on that, then that conversation is had at that time as to how feasible that might be. So I don't have a crystal ball. I can't, you know, really predict exactly what would happen, but there's a number of scenarios that really bring it back to that same bottom line that would say it's going to go back to the statements of law, it's going to go back to the definitions, the prohibitions, and the situation at hand. Does all that mesh? And at what point in time does it make sense if a community chooses to enforce the ordinance, whether that be a resident or whether it be the municipality? Or you may not have that decision. That decision may be made for you if the corporation decides to sue the community when maybe you haven't taken steps to enforce it. You know, that does happen.
I'm going back to my studies when I was in school, and the federal government makes a law. The state cannot make a law that rides over the federal law. They can make a law that coincides with it, but not override it. So now we make a thing here saying, oh, we don't want this going through our town. The state steps up and says, we're going to pass it. The state says you can't. They can come through, and the governor signs it, and we know that this governor is in favor of it because he wants cheap power for Waterville Valley for his family business. Does this thing override what the state says, or are we going to be in violation of a multitude of our legislators and senators and the governor saying it is going through?
So there's really a two-part answer to that. One of them being that it depends on how you look at it. We're talking about a rights-based ordinance, and so from a rights-based perspective, there is enumerated within here governmental legitimacy. And what that's referring to is all legitimate governments in the United States owe their existence to the people of the community that those governments serve. And governments exist to secure and protect the rights of the people in those communities. And any system of government that becomes destructive of those ends is not legitimate, lawful, or constitutional. Where does that come from? Is anyone familiar with Article 10, Part 1 of the New Hampshire Bill of Rights? It's actually called the right of revolution. And I will read it verbatim because I think that's it.
And how does that affect the fact that New Hampshire is a state rights state?
Okay. So a number of rights that are enumerated within the New Hampshire Constitution. This is known as Part First Bill of Rights. Our state constitution has two parts. First part is the Bill of Rights. Second part is the form of government. So referencing Article 1, this is the origin and object of government, and I'm paraphrasing. All men are born equally free and independent, therefore all government of right originates from the people and is founded in consent. Article 2, natural rights. All men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. Article 8, accountability of officers. So this is all power resides, again, this is a reaffirmation. All power residing originally in and being derived from the people. All the magistrates and officers of government, so elected officials, are their substitutes and at all times accountable to them. Article 10, right of revolution. Government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the whole community, not for the private interest or emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. Therefore, whenever the ends of government are perverted and public liberty is manifestly endangered and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may and of right ought to reform the old or establish a new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. So what you're doing here at the local level is you are establishing a Bill of Rights for your community to say, based on the Bill of Rights within the New Hampshire Constitution. So is it in conflict? No. What it's in conflict with is the fact that statutory law doesn't align with our rights enumerated within the Constitution. So which one are we going to view as legitimate? You know, and that's really the question that when at the end of the day that I think we all as individuals have to wrestle with. Which one do we look at and say that, yes, that's the way it ought to be, that's legitimate. So when government doesn't operate according to the way that it was designed to operate, then it's not legitimate government.
But but we also live with the rule of the majority of the people. And if the majority of the people of the state of New Hampshire say, we want this to go through your town, do we still have the right to say to them, you don't know what the hell you're doing. We're going to form our own militia. If you want to come through here, you're going to fight us. I mean, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so you've got, what, 31 towns affected by this particular project. My understanding is that at least 20 out of those, maybe more, are officially opposed. So those that are most affected by governing decisions should be the ones making them. So for the communities that are directly affected by this project, should they not have the right to decide whether or not that project comes through?
I'm not arguing that point with you. I'm just throwing out these things that come up in my mind.
Whose rights trump whose rights?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's what you're getting
that's
at.
What I'm trying to bring
And
out
that's,
and stuff. And if Steve wants to stand up and says, I don't want that big box in there, stand right up, Steve. I mean, I have only done business with you how long?
I think we fought that battle.
Yeah. No, and that is the issue. The issue is who has more rights to decide, the people within the community or the corporations. And in this case, what the rights-based ordinance does is it says that the people within the community have that right, and that right is greater than the right of the corporation or the government to decide on your behalf, because you guys are the ones that are most affected, is what the rights-based ordinance is doing.
Michelle, can you just say that again? Who has more rights in the town?
So it's about who has more rights to decide what happens where you live, either the people in the community or the corporation. And that's what the rights-based ordinance is addressing. It's saying, spelling out that the people within the community have that right to decide more than the corporation or the government has that right to decide on your behalf. Because at what point in time did we ever say that we forego these rights? At what point in time did we ever sign them? And no, I'm not lecturing you. I'm just saying this, that at what point in time did we do that? We didn't. None of these have been amended to appeal these rights. They still exist. It's just that most of us, before I got involved in rights-based organizing in my own community, because we were affected by a project, I had never picked up the New Hampshire Constitution and read it. So most of us are just so busy with everyday life, putting a roof over our head, food on the table, doing what needs to be done to get by, and what's happening all the while is all this other stuff that is empowering corporations with more rights than we have within our own community, within the letter of the law. And when we learn what our rights are, then we have that kind of wrestling that goes on within us to say, well, what do I believe? And, for many, it resonates with us, especially in New Hampshire, We have a long history of local self-governing, and this is being eroded. I just mentioned that bill, from this morning. So another thing is that you bring up this point, and some of the things I think are really important to mention is that you're talking about preemption. You're talking about a legal doctrine called Dillon's Rule. So Dillon's Rule is the state is the parent, the municipality is the child. So the municipal entity, which is a corporate entity, but it's a public corporate entity, versus, we'll use Eversource as an example, they are a private corporate entity. So we can thank New Hampshire in 1819 with the Dartmouth College case, where it was determined that a private corporation is on equal standing with the state, whereas the municipal corporation is subordinate to the state. Well, if we're subordinate to the state, who are we also subordinate to? Corporations. So that is a legal doctrine that was decided by a court of law, not our legislation and not the people. That was decided by a court of law. And so that legal doctrine has been used in other court proceedings since then that has found corporate personhood rights within the Constitution. Every time a human being, a natural person, gains a right, corporations get to benefit from that because of a court decision, not because of legislation, not because of anything that we the people decided or gave up or anything of that nature. And the other thing that you're talking about is preemption, which is tied in with Dillon's Rule. And what that says is that essentially whatever the state passes as a law deems to be legal, the municipality can't rise above that. So we call it ceiling preemption. So whatever the state deems to be, let's say, protective. So we'll take maybe water contamination, and they say that it's okay to have 70 parts per trillion of PFOAs in your water. Well, I think it's safer to have none, but that's what the state says. And then a community, let's say, has 20 parts per trillion in their water, and everybody's sick and there's cancer clusters everywhere. So the state says 70, the community has a different experience, and this is just a hypothetical scenario. But what if that community wants to say, even if they were to look at it from a regulatory perspective, we won't even talk about rights-based, just a regulatory perspective. We want to set a level of 20 parts per trillion, or maybe 10, in our community because we feel that that is safer. So let's say that they do that. Preemption denies them that ability. So the state is saying that it's 70 parts per trillion. The community doesn't have the authority under the current structure of law and government to set a lower limit. That's preemption. Another example would be if a community were to, through a regulatory ordinance, to ban plastic bags. And the state comes in and carries out a law that says you can't do that. Or in New Hampshire, being Dillon's Rule, it's even more restrictive in the sense that because there is not a specific RSA statute in New Hampshire that says that the municipality can ban the plastic bags, it's just assumed that you cannot. Whereas a home rule state would say that the municipality can ban the plastic bags so long as there is a state law that doesn't prohibit them from doing it. Both of them are subject to preemption. Both of them. So that idea that all that would have to happen in a home rule state is that special interests could lobby at the state level and say that we're going to, it's now, we prohibit the municipalities from banning plastic bags. And let's say 20 communities have already done it. All of their local ordinances to ban plastic bags get overturned by that preemptive law. Preemption is great when it's there to set a floor. It's not good when it's setting a ceiling, when it doesn't allow the communities affected by whatever is affecting them to set a lower limit, a safer limit, or a prohibition, because maybe there is no safe limit. So what a concept. What if we said no? None at all. We don't want mercury in our water, or we don't want PFOAs, or whatever. As Gail brought up earlier, it forces the corporations to be responsible, to be sustainable, to be accountable, and to find a way to bring forth whatever project or service that their product or service that they're looking to bring forth in a manner that is compatible with the people living there and the natural environment of that community. It was that way after the Revolutionary War. This is what we fought for, was the right of local self-government. That was what was being infringed upon, which is what got the colonies involved in that war. You know, people think, oh, it was, you know, it wasn't the king's tea that was thrown into the harbor. It belonged to the East India Company. You know, the corporate state has existed long time. This is nothing new. And here we are, how many, you know, centuries later now, dealing with the same thing. We're still confronting the corporate state, where the state and corporations are like this, and the communities are out here, and the people are screaming at the top of their lungs, you know, this is not good, or this isn't what we want. It's basically, we don't consent, and yet it's being forced and pushed upon communities, whatever the issue may be. And so here we are. There have been so many attempts through regulatory laws. There have been so many attempts through legislation to attempt to grant, let's say, greater control to communities, and then they just find ways to get around it, be it preemption or whatever. And so at this point in time, there is, referencing Article 10, what remedy is left? What remedy is left? Even the courts are siding with corporations and governments when they bring in harmful activities. So, you know, when we attempt to fight through the legal system sometimes, we find that, you know, even that isn't a course of remedy. So then what? These are the kinds of questions that we all have to kind of think about. Is it true that any developer or corporate activity, corporation, could look at this and just say, we're going to ignore it? Sure. They can do that. Can they just continue to move forward with the project? Yes. And violate your rights? Yes. The question is, what are you going to do about it?
Michelle, is it fair to say that because an RBO is based in constitutional law, that if push comes to shove and we adopt an RBO, that push comes to shove, we end up in court, it changes the conversation from a regulatory issue to a constitutional issue, and with an RBO, it's an advantage to be arguing in a constitutional conversation. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings me to what, are you looking to talk about the amendment?
Well, yeah, I could do that, but also I have to comment on that subject because the difference between having an RBO and not having an RBO is that you get to have a conversation. Because without it, you know, we go back to the example of, I don't know, I should probably stop. Without it, if we go back to the example of the power line on Tenny Mountain Highway, we didn't have a leg to stand. We had no way to even get their attention. Right? There was nothing. Had we had an RBO, we could possibly have said, you know, some one of us, some community folks, or our town government could have said, you know, we would really like to talk to you because we don't want to have to invoke our RBO, for instance. So, and then at least you get to have a conversation. So, and interestingly enough, that plastic bag ordinance came to my committee, and I heard it last year. It was pretty interesting because the effect of it was the opposite of its intent, because what the folks who brought the bill wanted to give the towns the right to control whether grocery stores could use plastic bags. They wanted the towns would have had the right to create an ordinance that would have required grocery stores to use non-plastic bags. the bill got killed, and basically the reasoning was because we are exactly what you said, Mike. We are not a home rule state, you know?
Exactly.
Right. So, and that doesn't have anything to do with our rights. That has to do with the statute, which is the back end of the Constitution, not the front end of the Constitution. So what we're talking about here is activating the front end of the Constitution. And frankly, as I look at it, what this basically amounts to is nonviolent nonviolent resistance. You know, we will be resisting the system by doing this. We need to know that that's what we're doing. We are saying, you know, this system, you know, we could say this is our way, something short of manning the barricades of revolution. This is our little revolution against that which exists in our government today. That's the way I look at it. I'm good for it. All right. So my job as your state legislator is to bring a constitutional amendment. Where the heck is it?
Here, Steve.
No, I have it here. I have it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Right there, if you want it.
That's fine, I get it. Is to bring a constitutional amendment to the legislature. And so it is known as CACR 19. That's the number it stands for. Constitutional Amendment Concurrent Resolution. And so it has some very particular things. So basically what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to amend the Constitution of the state of New Hampshire to include language in it. It's pretty short. I could actually read it to you, and it's instructive because it's part of this whole mental process of getting around this. So the amendment says, all government of right originates from the people, is founded in their consent, and instituted for the general good. The people have the right and duty to reform governments when these governments manifestly endanger public liberty, revolution, and sustainable environment, endanger public liberty, and sustainable environment and economic development can be achieved only when the people affected by governing decisions are the ones who make them. Therefore, the people of New Hampshire have an inherent and inalienable right of local community self-government in each county, municipality, city, and town to enact local laws that protect the health, safety, and welfare by recognizing or establishing rights of natural persons, their local communities, and nature, and by securing those rights using prohibitions and other means deemed necessary by the community, including measures to establish, define, alter, or eliminate competing rights, powers, privileges, communities. Okay, by putting an RBO into place. Shorten it out. That's what this says. So,
Steve, can I
yes.
I guess I don't understand this word prohibition. Prohibition to me means not allowing something. Am I right?
That's what this constitutional amendment is allowing the local community to enact prohibitions.
So that we can say, no, you can't do this?
That are based on our inherent rights.
For the purpose of protecting health, safety, and welfare, so not just
Right.
for any.
Right. Not just any prohibition, you know. No Home Depot, for instance. That would be that wouldn't be one
I
of
would
them.
use that as a
Yes, David.
Hey, Jeff.
I'm nervous about the fact that sometimes at town meetings,
Yep.
the articles will be worded in such a way that you can't tell whether a yes vote would pass it or go against it. Will there be something done to clarify that so that people at the special town meeting will know whether whether they're voting for or against the thing they think they're voting for?
Well, that's not my piece, but what we're talking about.
Yes will mean we will
Adopt the article.
adopt the
RBO.
RBO.
Okay.
Yes, none of that, right, stuff that you see down in Concord. Oh my God. None of that stuff. So a constitutional amendment, it takes a supermajority to pass in both the House and in the Senate. So it's a high bar. And I would say to you that we should not count our chickens on this happening.
So what's the change from what it says now to what it's going to be? Is there just a few words in there?
Oh no, this is an entirely new. This is an entirely new amendment to the Constitution.
Thank you.
So this is a totally new piece of.
So it's going to take at least 2/3 of the state.
It's going to take 2/3, right? So the action involves being. What this is really doing is it's putting this proposition to the people of the state.
Yeah.
And so the legislature has to do it, and they have to agree to do that. And frankly, I think one of the largest arguments in favor of it is that, if we are government of and by and for the people, then we really should put this to the people so they can make their wishes known. If they don't want it, then that will tell us. If they do want it, then that will tell us. Okay, so it is for the legislature to deny the process so that the people of the state of New Hampshire get to weigh in on this, which would happen in November of this year, I think. Then that's the main argument against them not passing this legislation, because all it does is it allows it to go to a popular vote. And then the popular vote is it a 2/3 majority? So it takes a 2/3 majority. So as I see it, it's kind of this classic clash between the rights of our individual rights and our so-called corporate rights. So and it happens all over the place in every part of our lives. We're always trying to find that balance between what is my right as an individual versus what is the right of the community, or what is our right as a town, as opposed to what's the right of the state to find it. And it's based on, and frankly, I think there's a balance to be met there. And I think our balance is out of whack right now, because our balance has been the balance that gives individuals, natural people, rights has been denied to them by a whole bunch of statutes that basically take away all of our natural rights to shape things the way we want to see them. So,
Steve, the hearing is it February 5 or 6?
February
5.
6. February 6, yeah. So what will happen at the hearing is that it would be great if folks came, particularly if we get this passed, because that shows a real gravitas and a certain, and that's another demonstration to the legislature that there is a serious interest in this type of ordinance, and will carry a lot of weight. So one of the reasons I think we're doing this as a special meeting is so that we will have that in our hand to march to Concord with, to say to my fellow legislators, Exhibit A, Plymouth, New Hampshire, this is what we're up against. This is why we need an RBO. This is why we need to have you put it in the hands of the people to decide whether or not towns have the right to make this ordinance.
Legislative office building, room 103, 2 o'clock, show up at 1:30, they say. Is that right?
That sounds good. I think if you show up a little earlier,
Or maybe
then
it's 3:01.
We should announce this at the special town meeting.
we'll have it down. Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah, we'll know what we're talking about by then.
I think like one of the really important things to realize with the amendment is that when we talk about corporate rights and we talk about the court system and how that whole structure of law and government works together against we the people, that's what the amendment is really about. It's about making it very clear, not only to corporations, but also to the courts, that this is the intent. The intent is to recognize the rights of the people over the rights of corporations. When the rights of corporations are violating the health, safety, and welfare of the people. Another thing to note within that amendment is that it is limited, that a community could not use a rights-based ordinance and find protection under the amendment if that rights-based ordinance restricts or weakens any existing rights. So an example, regardless of how you feel about gun rights, a community could not ban guns within the community claiming that it's for their health, safety, and welfare to do so, even though some people may feel that way, because the federal Constitution grants us that right. We also have our state constitution that grants us that right to bear arms. So the community wouldn't fit into it, because that would be restricting or weakening an existing right. Human rights would be the same way. Anything that falls into that category. A community couldn't ban all Muslims and claim that somehow that protected their health, safety, and welfare. I mean, they could try. I'm just saying that they wouldn't find protection under the amendment. So the point of that is to make sure that what is happening at the local level is expanding upon rights that exist, not taking away rights that exist.
Right. I think that another thing to keep in mind is that there's nothing static about rights. You know, rights are in some ways like conventions. So if you think about like women's rights or civil rights or anything, those are all rights that we're not able to be, even though our Constitution said that all men were created equal. That didn't include women, you know, it didn't include slaves, didn't include lots of people. So it's a matter of interpretation. So that was an reinterpretation of the Bill of Rights that caused the change in the statutes that followed from it, and also in the body of law that now guarantees women the right to vote and abolishes slavery and lots of other things that have come along. So this is a moving target, and we're part of it. Here we are, right?
Yeah. I think another thing that popped into my head, Mike, you brought up, we're not a home rule state, and a number of us have said that, but. So it's been brought up that we're not a home rule state, and that is true. However, you don't have to be a home rule state to recognize, if I could use that same term, home rule authority. We already have home rule authority in many areas of our local governing. So to say that, well, we're not a home rule state, therefore we can't do this, what they're saying is that it's not within our Constitution, hence the amendment. You know, the amendment is to enumerate, not to grant us the right, because governments don't grant rights. We have them because we're human beings and we were born. They're inherent and unalienable. But to specifically recognize, secure, and protect that right, to make it clear, to enumerate it. And it's not a full home rule, broad-based type of amendment either. It doesn't grant communities authority to do anything and everything they want. It's to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the community using prohibitions, so long as it doesn't restrict or weaken any existing rights. There's a lot of authority that, well, I won't say a lot, there's authority that municipalities do have
And yes, that is granted by particular statute from the state, but that is a form of home rule. It's granting the municipality the authority. So to say that we're not a home rule state is a moot point. It's just a smokescreen distracting kind of argument to take our focus off the real issue, which is this is our constitution, a people's constitution, and it's ours to amend as we see fit. And this is a people's amendment. Law is organic, is meant to change, to serve the needs of the people of that time, which is why we have Article 10 in our Constitution, because when that Constitution was drafted, it was recognized that law would need to change.
Hey, I'd like to make a comment. My name is Sam Sargent. I would direct it to you, Mr. Bolton. Been very quiet. I've learned a lot since I came in with somewhat of a blank slate, and it's late at night, and I don't get any smarter as it gets later.
Only one of the
If we can look forward to a week and a day and imagine that it is the special town meeting. I don't know, what do we got, 25 Plymouth residents here maybe? I have no idea how many you would anticipate, but I would encourage publicity of whatever form could be maximized in the remaining amount of time. And if I were a less informed voter who happened to show up at this special town meeting because my next door neighbor had encouraged me to do that, shamed me into watching the news and going to sleep and having a beer, I would be very interested in what the selectmen of Plymouth's position on this ordinance is. Could you speak to that issue, please?
So Jules, PPTV, you probably didn't hear that, but Mr. Sargent wants the select board to describe their position on the RBO. And I can't speak as a selectman on behalf of all selectmen, but my personal opinion.
Wasn't it,
I voted on it.
We voted to have the vote.
was that in non,
No,
it was out? Yeah.
we voted to have the special meeting to consider the RBO, to bring it before the legislative body. So I don't think we indicated support or, I don't think we supported it or denied it. Regardless, my personal opinion is I very much support the RBO, passage of the RBO. And even if there still is a question about legality, what it does is provides the select board a tool. And what would be very helpful too is to send a message out to other towns along the route. And Ashland is here tonight. They're considering it. I mean, it would be far greater to have a unified front to fight the project once it's finally approved, which it probably will be. So I support it. But thank you.
I think Mr. Sargent was volunteering to be in charge of our publicity.
Sam, just...
my problem is I irritate people.
That's publicity.
No, that's very good advice. I will say there have been a number of letters to the editor. There are posters in the storefronts. There are flyers on counters in stores. And it's on the town website. It's on public TV. So it's out there, and I do believe we're going to have a significant turnout. I mean, I've heard very good things. We've also had people with e-distribution lists that have been mailing it out. So I'm fairly confident the word is out there. I think tonight.
For my benefit, where and what time?
It's at the Plymouth Regional High School Auditorium, Wednesday, January 31, 6:30 p.m.
Not the grade school, but the high school.
Correct. High school. Okay. Thank you all very much. It's been a very good conversation, and I look forward to seeing all of you on the 31st, and all of your Plymouth voting friends and neighbors. Bring them along. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick.
Thanks, Dick.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.